Imagine you spent 84 years absolutely convinced that being born was the worst thing that ever happened to you. And you still showed up. Every day. Made coffee, went for walks, fed the cat. Outlived most of your enemies and all of your optimistic friends. That is not a tragedy. That is a punchline. And the man at the centre of it knew it was a punchline, which is why he is far more interesting than every philosopher who ever tried to sell you a reason to get out of bed. His name was Emil Cioran. He was born in 1911 in a small village in Transylvania, which is already a more cinematic origin story than most people get, and he spent the better part of the 20th century writing about the inconvenience of existence. He wrote about despair the way a mechanic talks about a busted engine, precisely, without drama, with the slightly bored authority of someone who has taken the whole thing apart and laid the pieces on the floor and is now explaining to you in exhaustive detail exactly why it was never going to work. That is a sentence that should be on his tombstone. He kept waking up, not because he found the reason, not because some therapist handed him a gratitude journal and turned his life around. He kept waking up because that is what the body does. And Cioran, who distrusted the mind's conclusions more than almost anybody alive, had the intellectual honesty to admit that the body's stubbornness was at least as true as anything he'd written. This is the last episode of Fire and Ice. All season we've been sitting with thinkers who found their clarity at the edge of something extreme. Dostoevsky in a Siberian prison, Kafka in a body that was eating itself, Patočka with a government that wanted him erased. These were people for whom philosophy was not a career. It was the thing you did instead of falling apart. Cioran fits the season and then some, because Cioran took the whole project one step further. He didn't find clarity despite believing that existence was fundamentally absurd. He found it because of it. Pessimism for Cioran was not the problem. Pessimism was the only honest starting point. Everything else was decoration. What we're about to enter is the life of a man who wrote the most brutally funny, formally beautiful, philosophically rigorous case for despair in the 20th century, and then had the audacity to live to 84. Let's get started. 835. Răşinari is a village in Transylvania so small and so thoroughly unremarkable that the most interesting thing about it is that Cioran came from there and never stopped trying to escape it. Population a few thousand. Located near Sibiu in what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire, bordered by hills, filled with livestock, governed by the rhythms of agricultural life and the particular silence that descends on small places when nothing is happening, which is most of the time. He was born there on April 8, 1911. His father, Emil Cioran, was a Greek Orthodox priest. This is the kind of biographical detail that critics love to pounce on, the son of a priest who becomes the most committed atheist pessimist in European philosophy. But let's not be too neat about it. Cioran himself was not interested in simple rebellions. What his father's vocation gave him was not something to reject. It was a texture, a way of taking the invisible seriously. The church taught him that the questions underneath ordinary life were the real questions. He kept that lesson. He just arrived at very different answers. His childhood was, by most accounts, something close to idyllic. Now this is important, and it's the part that confuses people. Cioran didn't grow up in deprivation. He didn't suffer early childhood trauma in any dramatic diagnosable form. He ran around the Transylvanian village with the freedom that only children in small places before the 20th century truly gets its teeth into him enjoy. He said later in interviews that his childhood was among the happiest periods of his life. And then he went to Bucharest to study philosophy, and something in him cracked open, and it never fully closed again. The University of Bucharest in the late 1920s and early 1930s was not a gentle place for a mind like Cioran's. He was reading everything: Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard, the German Romantics. He was 20 years old and discovering, with the particular horror of the intelligent young, that the world had already been accurately described and the description was not flattering. He encountered the work of Schopenhauer, a man who believed that consciousness was evolution's most unfortunate experiment, and found in it not despair but something closer to relief. Someone had said the quiet part out loud. It was around this time, somewhere in the early 1930s, that the insomnia began. And this wasn't a metaphor. Cioran could not sleep. Night after night he lay awake in his room in Bucharest, and the darkness was not peaceful. It was interrogative. It asked questions that the daylight hours papered over with lectures and meals and the ordinary maintenance of being alive. He described Insomnia later as the central event of his intellectual life, more formative than any book, more instructive than any teacher. When you cannot sleep, he wrote, you are left alone with yourself in a way that most people will never experience and would not choose. The performance stops. The character you've built dissolves. What's left is just the bare fact of consciousness sitting there running with nowhere to go. In 1933, he received a scholarship to study at the University of Berlin. He was 22 years old. Berlin in 1933 was, to put it politely, the epicenter of a political catastrophe in the process of becoming. Hitler had come to power in January of that year. The city was electric with the particular excitement of people who have found someone to tell them that all their problems have a single identifiable cause. Cioran watched all of this. He was young and brilliant and, by his own later admission, not immune to the energy of it, which is a sentence we'll return to later and sit with until it becomes genuinely uncomfortable. But in Berlin, and in the sleepless nights that followed him from Bucharest, something else was happening. He was writing, not studying in the traditional sense, not accumulating credentials or networking with the right professors. He was writing what would become his first book, the one that announced him to the world and should have prepared the world for what was coming, though the world, as usual, was not paying attention. He returned to Romania, and in 1934, at the age of 23, he published Pecumil Disperari, On the Heights of Despair, written in Romanian, written at speed, written by his own account as a direct transcript of what insomnia and the study of philosophy had done to his sense of reality. The book won the Royal Foundation for Literature and Art Prize in Romania, which means that a country gave a prestigious literary award to a 23-year-old who had spent the book arguing with forensic patience that consciousness was a disease, that hope was a con, and that the only honest response to being alive was to acknowledge that being alive was an imposition nobody asked for. Romania handed him a trophy. Of course, he accepted it. This is where the fault line appears. Because here is what the prize and the biography and the crisp intellectual origin story do not prepare you for. Cioran was not performing. He was not a provocateur doing pessimism for the aesthetic. He was not a clever young man striking dark poses for attention. The insomnia was real, the anguish was real, and the precision with which he mapped it was the precision of a man who had been living inside it long enough to know every corner. And yet, he was also 23 years old and brilliant and in Berlin during one of the most seductive political moments of the century, and a part of him, a part he would spend the rest of his life trying to account for, was not keeping his distance. The mind lies. Not occasionally, not only when the stakes are high enough to justify it. The mind lies as a baseline function, the way the heart pumps and the lungs inflate. You are not aware you're doing it, and that's the point, that's the mechanism. The entire architecture of comfortable selfhood is built on a foundation of things you've decided, below the level of conscious decision that you will not look at directly. Cioran spent 60 years writing about this with a focus that bordered on the clinical. He made a career out of naming the lie. He was the philosopher of radical honesty, the man who sat in the wreckage of every consoling belief and reported back with something approaching cheerful contempt for anyone still clinging to it. And in 1936, at the age of 25, he published Schimbarea la fata a Romani. Oh, God. He published... Let's try that again, shall we? I'm going to, again, apologize to any Romanian speakers. He published Schimbarea la fata a Romani. I think. It sounds Latin to me. I'm pronouncing it Latin, but it's clearly not. It means, after all that, The Transfiguration of Romania, a book which Emil Cioran, the man who built his entire philosophical identity on the refusal to deceive himself, expressed genuine, considered, articulate enthusiasm for the Iron Guard. Now, the Iron Guard was Romania's fascist ultranationalist movement, and they wrote admiringly of Hitler and Mussolini as the kind of leaders Romania needed if it was ever going to become something more than a provincial backwater on the wrong side of European history. He was not naive. Now that's the thing that we can't give him. He was 25, spent 3 years in Berlin watching what these ideas looked like when they found their infrastructure. He wasn't a village boy who didn't know what he was endorsing. He was one of the most intellectually serious young philosophers in Romania, and he endorsed it anyway, with arguments, with passion, with the same forensic energy he brought to everything else. The book is not an aberration neatly separable from the rest of his work. It's written in the same voice, the same rhythm, the same unflinching willingness to follow an idea to wherever it leads, regardless of the company you find when you get there, which is either proof that the ideas themselves were always capable of going somewhere terrible, or proof that a 25-year-old brain is genuinely not the same instrument as a 40-year-old one, or proof of both things simultaneously, which is the least comfortable option and therefore almost certainly correct. He moved to Paris in 1937 on a French Institute scholarship. Then the war happened. The Iron Guard, emboldened by exactly the European political energy Cioran had found so compelling in Berlin, carried out pogroms in Romania. The Holocaust arrived and did what it did with industrial efficiency across the continent, and Cioran, sitting in Paris, watched what the ideas he had briefly celebrated produced when handed a budget and a bureaucracy. He did not republish the book, not once in his lifetime, not in Romanian, not in French, not in translation. It stayed buried. He kept it buried with the deliberateness of a man who knows exactly what he's doing and has decided that doing it is the least bad available option. The question is not whether this was enough. History rarely gives us enough. The question is what it means that the most honest philosopher of the 20th century carried a suppressed book in his past like a stone in his coat pocket and spent the rest of his life writing about the impossibility of escaping yourself. Because either he was the greatest hypocrite in modern philosophy, or he became the philosopher he became precisely because he knew what he was capable of, had seen it in print in his own sentences, wearing his own arguments, and couldn't unknow it. When interviewers found him in his Paris apartment in his later years and asked about the book, the answers were unsatisfying. He acknowledged it. He acknowledged something adjacent to remorse without ever quite arriving at the full structure of it. He said he was young. He said the political atmosphere was intoxicating. He said he had been wrong. And he said those things the way a man says them when he has rehearsed them enough times to know they will not fully satisfy, and has accepted that non-satisfaction as the appropriate tax on what he did. Critics were not always charitable. Some were less than charitable. Some used the book to dismiss everything that followed. This is the lazy move, and Cioran knew it was the lazy move and probably anticipated it. Because the lazy move in philosophy, as in life, is to find the one bad thing a person did and use it to excuse yourself from engaging with everything else. If Cioran was simply a fascist sympathizer, then you don't have to sit with the argument that consciousness is a disease. You don't have to take seriously the possibility that the self is a fiction held together by the strategic refusal to look at certain things. You don't have to ask whether the same mechanism that let a 25-year-old philosopher endorse a fascist movement is the same mechanism currently running in you right now, keeping you from looking at whatever your equivalent buried book happens to be. Because you have one. You don't get to use Cioran's to avoid your own. And every morning he kept waking up in a small apartment in Paris with the full weight of what he had written and what he had become, and the gap between them sitting quietly in the corner like a piece of furniture he'd stopped noticing. He had looked directly at the worst version of himself, in print with his name on the cover, and he kept going anyway. Not cleansed, not redeemed, just going, just writing the next sentence. That is not an excuse. But it is, when you look at it honestly, something, at least. At some point in the late 1940s, Emil Cioran made a decision so strange, so voluntary, so apparently self-destructive, that even by the standards of a man who had already made several questionable decisions, it stands out. He decided to stop writing in Romanian, permanently. He would write exclusively in French from that point forward. It was a language that he had to fight for every single sentence. Like someone learning to walk on a surface that keeps tilting. To understand how drastic this was, you need to understand what it means to write in your mother tongue. Your first language is not just a communication tool. It is the architecture of your thinking. The rhythms are pre-conscious. The metaphors arrive already loaded. You don't choose your native language any more than you choose your skeleton. It's the structure inside the structure. Cioran could write in Romanian the way a pianist plays a piece they've known since childhood without looking at their hands, and he threw that away deliberately at the age of 37. His explanation when he gave one was that French forced him to slow down. That in Romanian he could write without thinking, and writing without thinking was precisely the problem. French made every sentence cost something. Every word required a decision. The distance between his thought and its expression became a gap he had to cross consciously every time without a bridge. And in that gap, he claimed, something more honest happened. The automatic pilot of the mother tongue was also the automatic pilot of the ego, the self-serving narrator who smooths the rough edges and makes your ideas sound better than they are. French killed the narrator. What was left was just the argument, naked, standing in a foreign kitchen and slightly embarrassed. A Short History of Decay was published in French in 1949. Syllogisms de l'amertume. I think that's right. Syllogisms of Bitterness followed in 1952. The Temptation to Exist in 1956. The Fall into Time in 1964. One book after another, built word by word in a language that remained, by his own description, permanently uncomfortable. He won the Rivarol Prize in 1950 for A Short History of Decay, an award for excellence in French literature by non-native authors, which is either deeply ironic or perfectly appropriate depending on how much you enjoy the universe having a sense of humour. The life around his writing was, by any conventional measure, a spectacle of voluntary deprivation. No academic permission, no salary, no institutional affiliation. He lived for years in a small chambre de bon, a maid's room in the Latin Quarter of Paris, with his partner Simone Bouet, who was a teacher and whose income kept them both alive. He rejected every grant, every honour that came with a financial attachment, every opportunity to convert his growing reputation into material comfort. Not because he was indifferent to money in the way people who have plenty of it can afford to be, but because he appeared to have made a genuine philosophical decision that the moment he owed something to an institution, the institution was inside the work, and the work would lie. I can resonate with that. It's partly why I don't go for sponsorship or adverts on this. Not that I get sponsorship, you tiny channel, go fuck yourself. He was not romantic about this. He was not performing bohemian poverty for an appreciative audience. He was cold and precise about it, the way he was cold and precise about everything. He had looked at what ambition did to thinkers, watched them curve toward power, watched their sentences soften at the crucial moment, and he had decided that the only protection against it was to have nothing to protect. You cannot compromise a position you don't hold. You cannot be bought if you have preemptively made yourself worthless to the market. Now let's move on to the crisis. Cioran wrote about suicide with the calm specificity of a man who has genuinely thought it through. Not as a gothic pose, not as provocation, with philosophical rigour. He wrote about it as a live option, as a coherent response to the situation of being conscious in a world that didn't ask for your consciousness and has no particular use for it. He wrote about the catastrophe of birth, about the fundamental injustice of being brought into existence without consent. He argued that the only true free act available to a human being was the decision to continue or not. Everything else was compulsion. And that compulsion continued for decades, through the writing and the poverty and the prize he accepted and the grants he refused, and the interviews in which he was charming and dry and funnier than anyone expected a professional pessimist to be. 84 years of continued existence from a man who had made the philosophical case for non-existence more eloquently and more rigorously than almost anyone in the Western tradition. This is not a small irony. This is the load-bearing kind. The whole structure rests on it. Because what it means is one of two things. Either Cioran was a fraud, a man who wrote about the abyss from a safe distance, treating real suffering as material for attractive sentences, never actually standing where he claimed to be standing. Or the books were not recommendations, they were something else entirely. They were something that looked like despair from the outside, but functioned from the inside as the exact opposite. The writing was not a record of a man being destroyed by his ideas. The writing was how he survived them. This is the part that stays broken. Because if the second thing is true, and the 84 years of continued waking up suggests it might be, then pessimism is not the conclusion. It is the method. And that changes everything about what you thought you were hearing. There is a particular kind of person who finds Cioran. You don't find Cioran because someone recommended him at a dinner party. You don't find Cioran because he came up on a reading list or because an algorithm decided you might enjoy him based on your previous purchases, or because some podcaster forces him on you on an episode. You find Cioran. I do not consent to Cioran. You find Cioran at a specific angle of your own life when something has not worked out the way the operating manual suggested it would, and you are sitting somewhere, a train, a kitchen, a waiting room, with the quiet but insistent feeling that everyone around you has access to a frequency that you can't quite tune into. You find Cioran when the official version of things has stopped being convincing and you need someone who is not going to try to sell you a replacement official version. But what does he say when you find him? He doesn't say it gets better. He doesn't say that suffering has meaning, that pain is instructive, that what doesn't kill you restructures your entire value system in a more resilient direction. He doesn't say any of the things that self-help has been saying in various fonts and binding colours since the industry decided that despair was a market segment. What Cioran says is far more radical and far more useful than any of that. He says, yes, it is as bad as you think it is. Yes, the structures you were given to make sense of your life are held together with good intentions and wishful thinking. Yes, consciousness is genuinely strange, and the fact that you find it difficult is not a personal failing. And yes, existence is fundamentally, constitutively, irreducibly absurd. And then he hands you a perfectly constructed sentence and walks away. This is the revelation. Not that pessimism is wrong, not that Cioran secretly believed in something warmer and was just being theatrical, but that pessimism, wielded with enough precision and enough dark humour and enough formal beauty, functions as a kind of liberation. Not liberation from the problem, liberation from the exhausting pretense that the problem is not the problem. Consider what it costs to maintain optimism in the face of evidence. The daily expenditure of energy required to keep the official story running. The story in which your life is progressing towards something, in which the difficulty is temporary, in which the discomfort is the tuition fee for a lesson you are definitely about to learn. This is not a free operation. It runs on something. It runs on the constant suppression of everything that doesn't fit the story, the daily labour of not looking too directly at what Cioran looked at directly all day for 60 years in a small Paris apartment in a language that wasn't his own. What Cioran discovered, and what the 84 years of continued existence proves more convincingly than any argument he ever wrote, is that you don't need the story to stay alive. You don't need the consoling narrative, the forward momentum, the sense that it's all building towards something. You need the next sentence. You need the precise description of the thing in front of you, however uncomfortable, however funny, however devoid of obvious redemptive structure. The accuracy is enough. The accuracy, it turns out, is the thing that keeps the lights on. This is why the language switch matters more than it first appears. When Cioran abandoned Romanian for French, he was not just changing his tool, he was dismantling the automatic machinery of self-consolation. Romanian thought too fast. Romanian knew too many shortcuts. French made him slow down and look at what was actually there, without the benefit of a native speaker's accumulated emotional shortcuts. He made himself a foreigner in his own work. And a foreigner sees things the locals have stopped seeing precisely because the locals have stopped needing to see them. The locals know the terrain. The foreigner has to read every sign. Every book he wrote in French is the work of a man who has removed the anaesthetic and is describing the procedure in real time, calmly, with occasional dry wit and making notes. This is not a comfortable thing to hear. It's also, for the right ears at the right moment, an enormous relief, because the anaesthetic was always the problem. Not the pain, the anaesthetic, the story, the optimism, the forward momentum is what prevents you from seeing clearly enough to do anything useful with where you actually are. Schopenhauer, who Cioran read as a young man in Bucharest, had argued that the only escape from the suffering of existence was the suppression of will, the quieting of desire, the withdrawal from wanting. It's a beautiful and completely impractical solution that works best if you are already quite comfortable and have a talent for stillness. Cioran took Schopenhauer's diagnosis and arrived at a different prescription. Not suppression, expression. The sentence. The precisely right sentence about the precisely wrong thing. The joke that makes the abyss slightly more hospitable, not because the joke closes it, but because it confirms that you can see the abyss clearly and still be funny about it, which is its own form of mastery. The suppressed book from 1936 matters here too, because a man who has seen himself endorse in print with his own sentences something that went on to participate in atrocity is a man who can no longer fully trust the narrator. The internal voice that says your instincts are sound, your judgments are reliable, your read on events is basically correct. That voice had been wrong in a way that left a permanent record, and so Cioran became, for the rest of his life, the world's most thorough skeptic of his own conclusions. Not paralysed by them, sharpened by them, the doubt that became the instrument. This is the shape of the thing. A man who was broken open by insomnia, who committed a political error, to put it politely, that he couldn't fully expunge, who murdered his own mother tongue, lived in voluntary poverty in a foreign city for the better part of 5 decades. This man produced some of the most precise, most alive, most genuinely useful philosophical writing of the 20th century. Not despite any of that, because of all of it. The wound was the method, the crisis was the equipment, and the pessimism was never the conclusion. It was always, from the very beginning, the only honest place to start. Let's pivot for a minute and talk about cats. In his later years, Cioran developed a habit of spending his afternoons in the Luxembourg Gardens in Paris feeding stray cats. And this wasn't a philosophical gesture toward the indifference of the natural world. This is feeding actual cats in an actual park with the specific tenderness that people who claim to have given up on existence tend to reserve for animals. He found their company, he said, more philosophically honest than most human conversation, which is both a devastating critique of human conversation and also the most reliable opinion a pessimist philosopher has ever expressed. This is the man who wrote In the Trouble with Being Born, published in 1973, that he had no difficulty conceiving of a world without himself in it, but considerable difficulty conceiving of a world without coffee, which is not a statement of a man who has genuinely abandoned the will to live. That is a statement of a man who has found at the bottom of every philosophical argument against existence a very small and very specific set of things that make the whole enterprise marginally worth the inconvenience. Cats and coffee. The precisely right sentence. The walk through Paris in the early morning when the city is not yet performing itself. Cioran wouldn't call these reasons to live. He was far too honest for that, but he also wouldn't pretend they were nothing. That was the other side of his radical honesty. He was just as unsparing about the small pleasures as he was about the large despairs. Both were true. Both were real. The pessimism wasn't a filter that removed the pleasure. It was the thing that let you see the pleasure without dressing it up as something more important than it was. And then, sometime in the late 80s, the disease arrived. Alzheimer's, which, if you were writing Cioran's life as a novel and your editor asked you to come up with the cruelest possible final act for a philosopher who lived entirely in language, who built an entire identity out of the precise management of thought, Alzheimer's is what you come up with, and your editor would say it was a bit too on the nose and ask you to dial it back and that no one would watch it. He kept waking up. Except, gradually he didn't know where he was when he did. The sentences that had been his entire method, his protection, his weapon, his way of metabolizing existence into something survivable, the sentences stopped coming. Not all at once. These things are never kind enough to be quick. They come slowly, piece by piece, the way a library burns when the fire starts in one corner and takes its time through the rest of the books. His partner Simone cared for him through it. She had kept him alive for decades with her teacher's salary while he refused every grant and prize and institutional lifeline on philosophical principle, and she kept him alive now. He died on June 20th, 1995. He was 84 years old. The city was Paris. The language he left behind was French. The Romanian he had killed in himself survived him in the books he'd never allowed to be republished. Cioran, the man who made the most rigorous case in 20th century philosophy for the fundamental absurdity of existence, who wrote about non-being with the focused appreciation of a wine expert describing a particularly interesting vintage, lived 4 years longer than the average French male of his generation. He outlived Sartre, he outlived Camus, he outlived Merleau-Ponty and Simone de Beauvoir, and most of the grand optimists of the post-war French intellectual scene who believed with genuine passion that history was going somewhere and humanity was broadly getting its act together. All of them gone. Cioran in the Luxembourg Gardens feeding cats. The philosophers we've spent this season with, Dostoevsky, Kafka, Berdayev, Shezdov, Bakhtin, Patochka, Fedorov, Solovyov, Khodorkovsky, Bloch, and now Cioran, that was a mouthful, none of them found their clarity in the comfortable middle distance. Every single one of them had to go somewhere genuinely cold and genuinely dark before they could see anything worth reporting back. That is not a coincidence. It's not a curatorial accident. That is the pattern underneath all the individual patterns. The people who describe the truth most accurately are not the ones who are protected from the worst of it. They are the ones who went directly into the worst of it and came back with notes. Cioran's notes happen to be funnier than most. This is worth saying directly. He is funny, not accidentally, not as a byproduct, deliberately, structurally funny, in the way that someone is funny when they've decided that the alternative, taking the whole disaster completely seriously, is both intellectually dishonest and completely boring. The pessimism and the humour are not intention, they are the same move. They are both ways of seeing the thing as it actually is, without the soft focus filter of what you would prefer it to be. This is what you take away from this episode, I guess. Not that existence is suffering, which you already knew. Not that consciousness is an imposition, which I'm guessing you've suspected for years now, but that the accurate description of the thing is itself a form of freedom. That you don't need a story in which it all means something in order to find the next sentence. That the cat in the Luxembourg Gardens is enough. That the coffee is enough. That the precisely right sentence, hard won in a language that never fully belonged to you, is enough. Not because enough is a lot, but because enough is true. And true, as Emil Cioran spent 84 years demonstrating with style and considerable dark wit, is the only place anything ever real ever starts. Emil Cioran spent 84 years building the most elegant, most formally beautiful, most philosophically rigorous case for why none of this was worth it. He wrote 30-something books, he loved cats and coffee and walked around Paris in a coat that had seen better decades. He outlived almost everyone, never got a proper job, never stopped writing. Never once in any interview, any book, any conversation that was ever recorded suggested that he had found the answer. He kept waking up. That is the answer. It's not the answer you wanted, I'm sure. It's not the answer with a structure and a reading list and a set of implementable daily practices. It's not the answer that comes with a companion journal on a premium subscription tier. The answer is that the man who thought hardest about whether any of this was worth it kept showing up anyway. And somewhere in the Luxembourg Gardens, with a cat eating out of his hand and a coffee getting cold on a bench beside him, something in him had clearly decided that today at least, for reasons it was not prepared to formally defend, it was. You're not required to find this comforting. Cioran will be the first to tell you that requiring comfort from philosophy is precisely the problem. Philosophy is not a spa break. It's not a weighted blanket. It is, at its best, the practice of seeing clearly enough to make your next move from somewhere real rather than somewhere imaginary. Cioran saw more clearly than almost anyone. He moved anyway, slowly, in the wrong direction sometimes, in the right direction eventually, always in French. This season, we've followed thinkers who had everything taken from them, freedom, health, country, safety, language, and came back from each loss with something sharper than what they had before. Cioran fits the season not because he suffered the most dramatically, but because he suffered the most philosophically. He went looking for the worst conclusion available and found it, and then had the extraordinary bad grace to live to 84, which is either proof that pessimism is good for your health, or proof that the universe has a sense of humour that makes his look restrained. Fire and Ice ends here, with a man in a park feeding cats, with the admission that existence is absurd, which you already knew, and the demonstration that knowing it doesn't have to be the end of anything. It can, if you're stubborn enough and honest enough and willing to kill enough of your comfortable certainties, be the beginning of the only thing worth beginning. The clear-eyed life, the earned sentence, the coffee before it goes cold. Cioran kept waking up. You might as well too. That's it for this season, you beautiful lot. If this episode landed somewhere, or if this season landed somewhere real for you, then make sure you share it. Send it to someone who's currently feeding their own stray cats and pretending that they have no idea why. You can leave a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. It doesn't cost anything, and it does mean more than the algorithm will ever admit. Well, of course, we are on the socials, which have been dead for ages. I apologise, I guess, but, I'll get there eventually. On TikTok, Instagram and X, we are at The Observing Eye. That's where all the short form eventually lives. We're on YouTube, of course. You can subscribe at youtube.com/at The Observing Eye. And you can leave a comment. You can tell us what affected you, what got you thinking, what you didn't like. And you can recommend philosophers for us to look at next. I do my best to read all comments eventually. And as soon as I can, which sometimes can be a few days because I just don't like looking at social media stuff much. If you want the full experience with no interruptions and no adverts, then the place you're looking for is theobservingeye.com, which is our Substack home. We have all the episodes in full with audio and some written stuff, and there's no ads because fucking adverts. You know I don't like adverts, so I'm not going to make you sit through them either. We just want to, have a conversation without being interrupted. It's very rude. You can also email me at david@theobservingeye.com. If you want to chat philosophical or just want to say hi. It's always nice to hear from you, beautiful lot. And a big thanks, of course, to those of you who have sent me a message already. Deeply appreciate it. On the note of appreciation, I want to thank all of you for taking the time to join me today. Your time is finite, your attention is precious, and your presence is all you have. So I want to thank you for sharing all of that with me. And I hope that you've managed to take something away from this episode, this whole season, and, it's got you thinking about things. That's the plan. Just start thinking about things. We are back. We are back. I am back. I don't know why I say we. It's just me. Me in my cupboard screaming into the void. Literally. Even when there's no microphone, just screaming into the void. When am I back? I need to check my calendar. I am back. When's Easter? Easter's next weekend, isn't it? Like the 7th of April? Yeah, 7th of April. After Easter, I'm having a little break to think about the next season that's coming up. We're going to be doing the realm of the Psychonauts. So, Terence McKenna, Timothy Leary, bit of Alan Watts, all those guys. Diving into some of that stuff. So, hopefully that will be interesting for all of you. Anyway, enough of me prattling on. Enjoy your Easter. Hope you've all got a bit of a break. Long weekend. And of course, take care everybody. Much love, and I'll catch you soon.